This is the POL242 bivariate presentation for Oran2012. Our research question attempts to locate factors which could have influenced political dissatisfaction with the Algerian government in 2006-2007. We are choosing to focus on this particular phenomenon because in May 2007, Algeria held elections for the National Legislative Assembly. These elections had the lowest voter turnout in Algerian history. Major political parties, as well as almost two-thirds of the electorate, boycotted the elections. Studies of behavior during and immediately after these elections identified a general sense of political distance and distrust amongst Algerian citizens. Our research attempts to locate factors which might have contributed to this dissatisfaction. We identified three hypotheses to account for political dissatisfaction. First, we hypothesized that respondents who felt that the government did not take sufficient steps to combat political corruption were more likely to display high levels of political dissatisfaction. Secondly, we hypothesized that respondents with high levels of formal education were more likely to display high levels of political dissatisfaction. Finally, we hypothesized that respondents who felt that the government was not doing enough to create economic opportunities for citizens were more likely to display high levels of political dissatisfaction. Our research is grounded in existing literature on Algeria. For H1, we drew on the work of Dillman, Lowy, Boindel, and Weirenfels. These scholars have argued that Algeria's position as a resource-rich, oil-exporting state has led to high levels of rent-seeking behavior amongst the political elite. Much of the political dissatisfaction of the Algerian electorate comes from the fact that reforms have been unable to challenge these networks of elite patronage. For H2, we drew on the work of Przowski, Limongi, and Robert Barrow. These scholars have used a modernization theory paradigm to argue that higher levels of formal education lead to a greater demand for participatory political institutions and therefore greater dissatisfaction with political authoritarianism. Finally, for H3, we drew on recent development studies literature on Algeria. This literature has pointed out that Algeria has not seen comprehensive redistribution policies that could have taken economic power out of the hands of a small elite. As such, the electorate's political dissatisfaction has often derived from Algeria's economic situation. To conduct our research, we used the dataset Arab Barometer 2006-2007. Our dependent variable was political dissatisfaction, or poldis. To measure this variable, we constructed an index of three indicators. Question 2512, are current courts always punish the guilty even if they are high-ranking officials? Question 2513, people are free to criticize the government without fear. And question 2514, people can join political organizations like political parties without fear. We conducted a reliability analysis on the indicators to assess their suitability to form an index. From our reliability analysis, the Cronbach's alpha was 0.8093 and the standardized item alpha was 0.8159. This means that the indicators were suitable to construct an index to measure the dependent variable. In constructing our index, low scores were given to low levels of political dissatisfaction and high scores to high levels of political dissatisfaction. We used three separate indicators to measure each of our three independent variables. For our first independent variable, government's attitude towards corruption, we used question 254. In your opinion, to what extent is the government working to crack down on corruption and root out bribes? For our second independent variable, level of education, we used question 703, level of education. For our third independent variable, government's attitude towards economic empowerment, we use question 5204, our government creates conditions for people to be able to prosper through their own efforts.
To test H1, we performed a cross-tabulation of the dependent and first independent variables. The tau c is 0.22. This suggests that the correlation is moderately strong. Furthermore, the p-value determined through the chi-square test is 0.000, which means that there is less than 1 in 1,000 chance that the correlation is due to sampling error. The results of the cross-tabulation are thus representative of the general population. If we compare the column percentages across high row, only 7.7% of respondents who felt that the government was cracking down on corruption to a large extent had a high level of political dissatisfaction. Conversely, 26.3% and 43.8% of those who said that the government was tackling corruption to a low extent and not at all had high levels of political dissatisfaction, respectively. As a general pattern, we can see that more of those who felt that the government was not doing enough to tackle corruption were likely to be politically dissatisfied. Go. To test H2, we performed a cross-tabulation of the dependent and the second independent variable. The Kramer's V is 0.078. This suggests that there is no acceptable association between the two variables. Furthermore, the p-value determined through the chi-square test is 0.47, which means that any correlation is due to sampling error. The data is thus not representative of the general population. The figures in the cross-tabulation table demonstrate that there is no clear correlation between the two variables. To test H3, we performed a cross-tabulation of the dependent and third independent variables. The tau c is 0.3. This suggests that the correlation is strong. Furthermore, the p-value determined through the chi-square test is 0.000, which means there is less than 1 in 1,000 chance that the correlation is due to sampling error. The results of the cross-tabulation are thus representative of the general population. 72% of those who strongly agree that the government creates sufficient economic opportunities for its citizens to prosper had a low level of political dissatisfaction. Conversely, only 30.7% and 29.1% of those who disagreed and strongly disagreed that the government creates sufficient sufficient economic opportunities for its citizens to prosper had a low level of political dissatisfaction, respectively. A similar trend can be seen if we compare the column percentages across the high row. Only 15.1% of those who strongly agree that the government creates sufficient economic opportunities had a high level of political dissatisfaction. Conversely, 29.5% and 46.8% of those who disagreed and strongly disagreed had a low level of political dissatisfaction, respectively. As a general pattern, we can see that more of those who felt that the government does not create sufficient economic opportunities for its citizens to prosper were likely to be politically dissatisfied. From our 3 cross-tabulations, we found that hypotheses 1 and 3 were supported, while our second hypothesis did not hold. For H1, there is a moderate level of association between views on government's attitudes towards eradicating corruption and political dissatisfaction. This cross-tabulation reveals a positive correlation between independent and dependent variables as per our hypothesis. For H2, there is a very weak and therefore unacceptable level of association between level of education and political dissatisfaction. We hypothesized that there would be a positive correlation between level of education and political dissatisfaction. However, the crosstab reveals no overall correlation between the variables. For H3, there is a strong level of association between the views on government attitudes towards economic opportunities and political dissatisfaction. The crosstab reveals overall positive correlation between the independent and dependent variables as per our hypothesis.
Since H2 was not supported, level of education is not positively correlated with political dissatisfaction. This means the Perzotsky and Limongi thesis that education is significantly correlated to dissatisfaction with authoritarianism does not hold in the case of Algeria in 2006-2007. Political dissatisfaction must affect all sectors of Algerian society regardless of their level of education.
Our research also shows that those who felt that the government was not doing enough to tackle corruption and those who felt that the government was not creating sufficient economic opportunities were likely to be dissatisfied with Algeria's political situation. Views about government attitudes towards economic empowerment were more strongly correlated to political dissatisfaction than views about government's attitudes towards corruption. Our research thus supports the work of George Joffe. Joffe has argued that it is primarily the concentration of economic wealth and power within Algeria's political elites that has caused political dissatisfaction in the country. Corruption itself is not perceived as negatively as the lack of economic opportunities. This suggests that an increase in political satisfaction and participation in Algeria is less important to eradicate corruption than it is to create sufficient economic opportunities. A consideration for future research could possibly try to find explanations for this phenomenon. Why is it that corruption is not perceived as negatively as one might expect it to be?